With Season 3 of House of the Dragon now airing, it's gotten me thinking a lot about this franchise and why people care about it so much. Game of Thrones has long been one of the most recognizable IPs in Western pop culture, and both fans and studios alike have spent years trying to identify and replicate what made it such a phenomenon. However, if the receptions of its two separate prequel shows this year haven't taught producers and creatives the right lessons, I don't know what will. But before I get into what this lesson is, you should know that I'm just thinking out loud here, so if you like my brain vomit, you know where the like and subscribe buttons are. Now without further ado, let's dive into the two sides of Game of Thrones. Many claim that Game of Thrones is just an edgy subversion of the fantasy genre that indulges in grimdark nihilism, reveling in the depravity of its world for shock value and offering little of substance in return. Sadly, there is truth to that, especially as the show goes along and veers further from the source material, but that's not why people fell in love with the story from the beginning. The grisly epic we all know started as an intimate, even somewhat wholesome story of a single family trying to survive in this brutal world intent on tearing them apart. And no matter how dark the show got, as long as it maintained these characters' journeys at its heart, it kept us caring and rooting for them. Contrary to what many claim, George R. R. Martin didn't write this story as a cynical deconstruction intent simply on traumatizing his audience. He wrote it as a story about real people, good people, in a world that is honest about what it costs to be a good person, without diminishing the value of that goodness. After all, though the story is filled with tragic deaths and defeats and a number of morally complex characters, for the most part, it seems virtue ends up paying off in the long run, while the villain's victories appear short-lived. Ultimately, there are two sides to the original show. At its heart, the story of compelling characters it gives us reason to like and to root for. And then there's the edgy subversion that dwells to a depressing degree on violence and vice for the sake of shock value, for which we can largely thank the showrunners and which gradually became more and more the predominant focus of the writing. And that brings us to the spin-offs, because each of these shows isolated one of the two halves of the original show, and the audience's reactions to them proved which one made Game of Thrones such a phenomenon in the first place. House of the Dragon started off with some degree of heart thanks to Viserys, but from the beginning it seemed to be turning up the dial on the violence and nudity, as if realizing they had already numbed their audiences to it in Game of Thrones. And once the one decent person at the center of the show passed, it quickly devolved into an imitation of everything Game of Thrones is most superficially known for without any of what kept people watching. And to no surprise, no one really seems to care about it anymore. To be clear, I'm not hating on the show. I'm still watching it, and I'll defend it from anyone who compares it to the final seasons of Game of Thrones, but I won't deny that watching it does leave me feeling much more empty and depressed than the original show ever did. Game of Thrones got dark, often unnecessarily so, but I kept watching because I was rooting for its characters, and many of them genuinely moved and inspired me. But in House of the Dragon, I can't help but wonder why I should care about any of the death and destruction when no one at the center of it is really worth rooting for. I don't feel much inclination to suffer through its most shocking moments when they're not making me feel anything for people I care about. The show keeps trying to crank up the brutality as if desperate to be taken seriously, but that's only going to turn off its viewers if they're not already invested, which most people clearly aren't. Then earlier this year, we got A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, which everyone adored, and it proved that the edgy shock and subversion was never why people fell in love with Game of Thrones. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is all the pure distilled heart of the original show, all its most wholesome elements, all its best character work and inspiring themes concentrated into one show, without any of the unnecessary brutality and cynicism to shock its audience into taking it seriously. It just tells a good story about characters people care about. And now everyone's saying the Game of Thrones universe is back, because that's what they've been missing since Game of Thrones started going downhill, and which House of the Dragon could never replace. But what do you think? What are your feelings on each of the three shows in this franchise? What made the original such a hit, and do either of the spin-offs capture any of the original magic for you? As always, I'm just here to kick off the discussion, so please, join me in the comments down below. Until next time, just keep thinking out loud.